In our last video for this unit, we're going to take another look at some of the deductive reasoning or logic laws from the last video, but we're going to look at some special cases for these, some ways that we might apply those patterns, but the sentences might be a little bit jumbled. I also want to take a quick look reminding you of some of our other validity that we can figure out. So talking a little bit more about our contrapositive statements and do a couple more examples on finding a counterexample, because I know that's been tricky for people. So first, let's look at some deductive reasoning applications. So you'll notice I have a few examples on here. On the left-hand side, I have statements that we used in our previous video, or similar to our previous video, like our first one. And so I want to show you what's another way that you could see this written that it would still make a valid argument. So our first example, if the street is flooded, then you'll need a boat to school. So again, I always like mapping these out. I don't know about you, but when I see all these words kind of mushed together, it's hard for me to figure out what the order is. I can see the order a little bit better when I translate it into symbols. So you don't need to do that, but if it helps, do it. Okay, so if the street is flooded, then you'll need a boat to get to school. Okay, so that's basically if P, then Q. Your street is flooded. It's a repeated idea from the first idea in the sentence. So that's our P statement. You'll need a boat to get to school. Well, wait a second. That's the same idea that we already labeled as kind of our Q statement. So this is definitely a valid argument. Technically, this is our detachment. And this is indeed a valid argument that we can make on this. So another version that we could see of this is look at the alternate version on the right-hand side. So another way that you could see this, and it still makes a valid conclusion with that statement 3, is start with your street is flooded, and then your second sentence says, if the street is flooded, then you need a boat to get to school. So if I look at the order and I do my labels, well, we already labeled your street is flooded. That was our P statement before. If the street is flooded, then you'll need a boat to get to school. Well, we label that as if P, then Q. And while this doesn't perfectly look like law of detachment, what would happen if you just read those two statements in the other order? So if you just flip-flop those two statements, you kept 3 where it is, and we labeled that as Q. So if you flip-flop these, then it actually fits your law of detachment. And so that's one of the biggest tricks that might get played on you, especially if you need to take the SOL or once we get to doing any benchmark assessments. That's one of the tricks they like to pull, is flipping those first 2 ideas, but keeping the conclusion, keeping statement 3 in the same order. So if you can read those first 2 statements in the other order and it still fits with one of the patterns we looked at, then it is still a valid conclusion with that third statement. So even though they're flip-flopped, it still works with that law. Okay, let's look at the next one. Again, this is taken right out of our examples from last lesson. Okay, if it does not rain, then I will walk to school. Okay, 2 ideas. If it doesn't rain, I'll walk to school. If P, then Q. If I walk to school, then I'll wear my hiking boots. Okay, well, walk to school was a repeat. I labeled that as Q. I'll wear my hiking boots. New idea, let's label that as R. So therefore, that's one of those we're repeating in the middle. So which law is this going to be? That's going to be law of syllogism. So if we write out our valid conclusion, we're going to want to go with if P, then R, or if we write it out, that'll be therefore, if, and I'm going to abbreviate, if it doesn't rain, then I'm going to wear my hiking boots. We can still come to a valid conclusion. So again, that was one of our examples from the last video. So a way that we could do this alternately, again, read the alternate version and see what I changed. So if I walk to school, then I'll wear my hiking boots. Wait a second, that's the same thing that was in the second sentence before. If it does not rain, then I'll walk to school. What is it? Same thing. These are exactly the same 2 statements as we have in this first example on the left-hand side. They're just reversed from each other. They're flip-flopped. Well, if I just read them in that different order, read statement 2 first. So if it does not rain, then I'll walk to school. if I walk to school, then I'll wear my hiking boots. It's exactly the same thing as the example from before. So I can actually use exactly the same idea for my conclusion. I can come to the same conclusion on it. So I can actually, using the power of technology, I'm going to take this and I'm going to, actually I don't have a way to copy that, so I'm going to have to just write that out. That's okay. So therefore, let me go back to the pen tool. So therefore, if it doesn't rain, then I'll wear my hiking boots. So again, all we did is read those two first sentences in the other order. Okay, go ahead and pause and try out this last example. Again, it starts out same exact example as we had from our previous video, and then look at how it changed on the alternate version. Try to come up with a conclusion for both of these. Okay, so if you look at the first example from lesson 1D, if you eat a good breakfast, then you won't be hungry till lunch. So if P, then Q. Second statement, you were very hungry after first block. So the way we did this last time was we called that negative or negated Q because it really is opposite from that main idea, but very closely related to that first sentence. So again, this is following our law of contrapositive. So it is definitely still we can still make a valid conclusion on this. So our conclusion would be therefore not P, excuse me. So therefore not P. So to write this out, so therefore I didn't eat a good breakfast. I'm going to abbreviate a little bit. I didn't eat breakfast. We can come to exactly the same conclusion on the alternate version. The only difference is they flip-flop those first two statements. So if I read those in reverse order, if you eat a good breakfast, then you won't be hungry till lunch. You were very hungry after first block. It's exactly the same as the previous example. So we can still use the same conclusion. So therefore, I didn't eat a good breakfast. Therefore, I didn't eat breakfast. Okay. So moral of the story is if they give you 3 statements and ask you, is the third statement a valid conclusion? Or if they just give you 2 statements and you don't think they quite match the pattern, try just reading them in a different order and see if that means that you can fit one of the patterns better. All right, again, you're not going to see too many of those, but they will occasionally pop up. All right, so a couple review problems just to kind of finish out the unit and review these ideas before you start thinking about reviewing for the test. Okay, so jumping over to the back of this page. So one of the ideas we talked about is that the contrapositive of the statement is always going to have the same validity as the original conditional statement. Sounds like a mouthful. So if I'm giving an if-then statement, if I'm giving a conditional, and I know it's true, that means the contrapositive also has to be true. But the reverse works as well. If I'm given a conditional if-then statement and it's false, then that means the contrapositive is also going to have to be false. They're going to have the same validity. So let's look at this. So first example A, conditional. If it's the end of the unit, then we have a test. Okay, so contrapositive, again, how do we write those again? And switch and flip. You're going to switch the order, flip the negation. So contrapositive statement says, if we have a test, then it's the end of the unit. Okay, so the original conditional statement, if it's the end of the unit, we have a test. This is pretty much true. That's when we usually give tests in all subjects. So that means I'm starting with a true statement. So that means if that one's true and I wrote my contrapositive correctly, then that means my contrapositive is also going to be a true statement. And this is where the law of contrapositive comes from, because if we already have this property, that's why we're allowed to say, hey, we have this law of contrapositive, and if I'm following those same order of ideas, well, then I'm still coming up with a valid conclusion. Alrighty, second piece. So our conditional. If I'm tired, then I didn't sleep enough last night. Okay, so wait a second, let's think of that. If I'm tired, then I didn't sleep enough last night. Do you think that's always going to be a true statement? So are there any days where you got a really good sleep last night, you slept 8 to 10 hours for all of my growing teenagers, and you still wake up tired? Well, yeah, that's a possibility, because, you know, maybe you did a lot of exercise the previous day, or maybe, unfortunately, you're starting to come down with, hopefully not something horrible, but maybe you have a cold and your body just needs more sleep. So if I start with this conditional statement, you know, I'm not convinced that that's a true statement. So that's a false statement. So let's see what happens with our contrapositive. Okay, so contrapositive, switch and flip. So if I didn't get enough sleep, and contrapositive, switch and flip. So I am tired has to flip over to then I'm not tired. Wait a second. I don't know about y'all, but when I don't get enough sleep, it's really hard for me to function the next day. And, you know, usually I'm going to be tired. So this statement is, if I didn't get enough sleep, then I'm not tired. Well, that doesn't make sense. You know, usually if you don't get enough sleep, your next day is going to be pretty hard. So that's actually a false statement. We can punch holes in that argument. So again, our conditional and our contrapositive are always going to have the same truth value, the same validity. Okay, so then last two examples, let's look at counterexamples again real quick, just for a review. So again, don't forget, a counterexample is you're trying to make a statement to prove something wrong. Specifically, if you're given a conjecture, just kind of like your hypothesis in a science experiment, you're saying a statement, and then we need to say something else to prove it incorrect. That's making a counterexample. So first example is, all prime numbers are odd. Okay, so, well, let's think of this. Prime numbers are things like 1, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13. Wait a second. A prime number is something that is only divisible by itself and 1. So those ones that I listed were odd, but can you think of any even numbers that qualify as prime, that they're only divisible by themselves or 1? Go really small. Huh. Our counterexample, what if we're looking at the number 2? Now, technically, if we go with our prime number definition, only divisible by itself and 1, well, 2 qualifies. It's divisible by 2, which is why we can call it even, but the only other number it's divisible by is 1, so he technically also qualifies as prime. So 2 is prime and it's even. So the number 2 is a counterexample to that conjecture. Okay, last example, all shapes that have 4 sides are squares. So think about a counterexample on this one. What would prove that statement wrong? So do you know any other shapes that have 4 sides but they're not squares? Well, yeah, we know a bunch of them. What about a trapezoid? Or a rhombus? Or to go Trekkie on you, if anyone recognizes that symbol, a Star Trek communicator, technically it's a quadrilateral, but there's no way in heck that that is a square. So any of those options, and there are more out there, but those 3 options all can count as a counterexample because they're proving that statement, all shapes with 4 sides are squares. Proves our conjecture wrong. So again, through today and tomorrow, which is technically our review day, make sure that you've gone through, double check to make sure that you've used all of your attempts on your lesson checks. So anything where you only have 1 attempt, you can go back and try that again if you want to go for a better score. You can go back and review our previous videos. We will have a review activity that we'll do together in class next time, but I'll also give you some time that you can go back and review and maybe test out some of the features that will be on our test on Friday. So again, let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you later.